Thank you for joining me during these live internet studies. My name is Arlen Lyman Hanavi, and I'm bringing you an hour and a half long worth of teaching that's broken up into two parts. Segment one is an hour long, given over to a study entitled Eschatology, a biblical study of end time events, where we're talking about basically eschatology, end time studies. It's really a study on the book of Revelation. We're just kind of working our way towards that using these different topics that I'm going to mention to you in a moment. The second half an hour study, sometimes it goes over, but it's supposed to be half an hour, is given over to an apologetic study on a Trinity topic. It's entitled A Trinitarian Response to Biblical Unitarianism. And we've been embarking on an intense, it really is a deep dive into Psalm 110, verse 1. And so I hope you're enjoying that study. We're just kind of taking it slowly and not rushing our way through the material. So looking at your screen right now, let's turn to eschatology, the eschatology study. As you can see now, we finally made it through topic 7, Excursus, the Islamic Antichrist, per Joel Richardson. And now we're ready to start on a new topic tonight. I don't know how long this will go. As with all the other topics, these were originally written for a study that I did over 20 years ago. It's coming up on 25 years now since I did the original study. And so each topic was actually written to encompass only a week's worth of teaching, right? But since this is the age of the internet, YouTube, iTunes, and things like that, I can go as long as I want. So topic 8, Yeshua's Olivet Discourse, part 1, and then that'll push us right into topic 9, Yeshua's Olivet Discourse, part 2. So we'll start in topic 8, part 1 tonight with the notes from a study that I wrote. Let's get back up the top there. There we go. On a study that I wrote entitled an eschatological essay on Matthew 24, 1 through 51, and the Olivet Discourse. And as I mentioned, we're only going to deal with part 1, so I think it's broken up right in the middle, like 24 verses 1 through 24, something like that, and then 25 through 51, something like that. So let's just jump right in. I'll start reading, and I'll pause whenever I need to make comment, but otherwise, the essay is fairly self-explanatory. It's short enough that I left myself space to read the verse and then make some commentary. When we get down into the verse-by-verse section, after the introduction and all of the other historical background and things like that, there's a little chart in here also. When we get down to the verse-by-verse section, again, you'll see it's pretty short. If I ever rewrite this and turn it into a book or upload it to my internet and to my website or anything like that, I'll probably expand all the verse-by-verse sections. But originally, when I wrote this, it was just, like I said, I needed to make it really short so that I could teach it in a week. So you'll be able to tell that when you take a look. All right, let's jump right in. An eschatological essay on Matthew 24, 1 through 51, and the Olivet Discourse. Introduction. The Olivet Discourse, recorded in the synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, represent a crucial eschatological teaching by Jesus. Given its occurrence on the Mount of Olives, this discourse is emblematic of Christ's intimate moments of instruction with his disciples. By the way, it's called the Olivet Discourse because Yeshua actually gave the discourse while he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, looking back at the Temple Mount and all of its buildings and things like that. We'll see that as we get to verse 1. So we're not really going to read through all of Matthew 24, 1 through 51 just in one reading. What we're going to end up doing is we'll read verse by verse, and it'll be, like I said, a kind of a miniature exegetical study or commentary essay on each little section or on each verse. So we will end up reading it, but not just in one setting. I recommend that you go back and read it on your own. As we're going to find out here in a moment, the story, the narrative is found in all of the synoptic gospels, so Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It does not show up in John. And I've chosen Matthew for a specific reason, although Mark and Luke have their own slightly different way of telling the same story, and Luke is particularly interesting in that it parallels some details that have to do with more of the preterist perspective. We'll get to that in a moment as well. Let's go back. Let's keep reading. Shared similarities, as I mentioned, across the gospel accounts underscore its significance. In Matthew 24, the discourse is a response to the disciples' query about the temple's destruction, the sign of Christ's coming, and we're going to see this when we get to it. So they're asking about some specific things. They have specific questions. So they're asking about the temple's destruction, the sign of Yeshua's return, and the end of the age. Mark 13 echoes these themes, focusing on the future tribulations and false prophets. Luke's version in 21:5-38 emphasizes the disciples' inquiry about the temple's downfall, and it expands into signs preceding the second coming. So, taken as a whole, we know that it was really one event. At least we suspect that it was one event where he was chatting with his disciples, and it's recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and yet each synoptic gospel writer records slightly different details, giving us kind of the whole picture when we sew it all back together. But and I'm not going to deal with this right now, but I'll talk about it maybe either between the two topics, or I'll talk about it after we deal with the second topic. I haven't decided which one I want to do. But in Luke's rendering, when we get to Luke 21, we'll find that there are a lot of details given that are really relevant for what we call the near-term aspect of Yeshua's words. Remember, and I'll flash a little graphic on the screen afterwards in post-production for you to see this. When we talk about prophetic telescoping and we're dealing with end-time prophecy, or really any kind of prophecy in the Bible, it's not unusual to find overlapping themes that represent a near-term event, like near to the writer, as in chronologically near, maybe something that was right around the corner. And then a far-term event, which is much farther in the future, could be hundreds of years, or in this case, it's almost 2,000 years later than Yeshua spoke the words. So using the near-term or prophetic telescoping kind of template, when we look at Yeshua's words here in Matthew, it's sent, or in the Olivet Discourse, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, what we end up finding is that there were events that he was talking about that are relevant for the immediate siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD and the expulsion of the Jews from Jerusalem in the 130s. Most of this would have been in the 70s, the destruction of the temple. So when we examine Matthew and Mark and compare it to Luke, we find that Luke has more details that are relevant to the 70 AD event and the siege of Jerusalem, versus Matthew and Mark seem to have more details that are relevant for what we would consider to be the final end time siege on Jerusalem, the rise of the Antichrist, the ushering of the Great Tribulation, which then gives rise to the wrath of God being poured out on wicked humanity, etc., i.e. the 70th week of Daniel. So that's really, when we compare the three, what we end up finding. In order to see and appreciate the full scope of what Luke adds to the discussion when compared to Matthew and Mark, when the time comes, I may back up in Luke to chapter 17 and show you how there are some parallel details that either represent kind of a separation between words that Yeshua spoke at that time, but got separated in the chapters between 17 and 21, or, as in many Bible authors believe, Yeshua simply had a similar discussion at a different time with his disciples, and yet the wording is similar to chapter 21 in Luke. So it's not, it may be the Olivet Discourse, it may not be, but either way, it's directly tied into details concerning the immediate siege that's right around the corner from Yeshua and the disciples' day. That's Luke 17. All right, let's keep reading my commentary here, my essay. The Olivet Discourse employs apocalyptic language. You guys know what I mean when I say apocalyptic? We're talking about, let me just highlight it here and see if it gives me a definition. Here we go. Apocalyptic. It's an adjective describing or prophesying the complete destruction of the world, right? Resembling the end of the world. So when we say apocalyptic, we're talking about something that's grandiose, something that's all-sweeping, which again, keeping in mind that we're using near-far prophetic terminology in the Bible, we can have overlapping terminology that can get dual usage. So Yeshua can be talking about when you see the army surrounding Jerusalem, like in Luke 21, we're going to read those words. When you see the army surrounding Jerusalem, well, when did that happen? Well, it happened in 70 AD, but it's going to happen again at the end of the age during Daniel's 70th week. So Yeshua only spoke once, but because of the apocalyptic nature of his discourse, then the prophecy gets dual application. Short, small, shorter, closer to when Yeshua spoke them, near aspect, and then farther, complete, final fulfillment, closer to the days that we live in now. So that's what we mean by near, far, or prophetic telescoping, and the apocalyptic language works for both time periods. Let's keep reading. So we got the Olivet Discourse employs this apocalyptic language, just like the book of Revelation, and imagery, and it accentuates the necessity of spiritual readiness amidst impending upheavals. The discourse, I go on to say, serves as a prophetic insight into the climax of history, cautioning against deception, and we're going to see this when we start reading Yeshua's words, encouraging perseverance, and reminding believers of Christ's eventual return for judgment and restoration. Now, this is interesting. Let me pause again just real quick. When we begin to read through Yeshua's words, we end up with the sense that there's this urgency of the matter. And indeed, the first century disciples and authors of the New Testament, Paul included, had this general sense that when Yeshua spoke about his second return, about his second coming, they really had the general sense that he might be returning at any moment. Perhaps he was indicating some form of imminency, meaning I could return, but there are events that are associated with my return. And because you don't know when those events are going to take place, then you just need to be ready at any moment for these events to unfold and then my return to happen. So on the one hand, I don't believe Yeshua was trying to say that I could return even before the day finishes. I'm going to go up into heaven, then in a blink of an eye, I'm going to come back down. And you couldn't even imagine that it was just going to be that fast. I don't think that's what he was talking about when we discussed this topic of imminency, right? The imminency of Yeshua's return. Rather, there are definitely events that are going to set up the return of Yeshua. Indeed, when we start reading through Matthew, we're going to find that he uses these time markers, this kind of sort of chronology where he keeps saying, when you see these things, and after that, after those things, after this, then this will happen, then this will happen. So it moves along sequentially in a natural fashions. And he also at a few points says, he gives details, and he says, but the end is not yet. And so if his return is coupled with the end of the age, like he was teaching, then surely his return is not altogether imminent. And yet, and this is the point I'm really trying to highlight, his return is certain. It will happen. And so rather than teaching imminency, it's really best to just understand that Yeshua was teaching expectancy. So we don't have to think that, well, he could come even before I finish out tomorrow, because we have to take a look around at all the other events that he described would happen and ask ourselves, is it time yet? And he even gives a parable. He says, learn the parable from the fig tree. Learn the parable from, when a storm is coming. You don't just expect it to start raining out of a blue sky. You don't expect the fig tree to just blossom in the middle of winter or something like that. There are definite warning signs, or a way for you to tell when a certain season is near, when a storm's approaching, etc., etc. So that's why I said imminency is not really the best way to interpret his words, rather expectancy, especially as the events that he's going to be describing, we're going to be reading about, start happening all around us. We're talking about all kinds of political unrest, nations, we're going to war against nations, all kinds of earthquakes in diverse places, cosmic signs in the heavens and the earth, the sun, the moon, stars, etc., etc. The persecution of believers for the name of Yeshua, and that he's going to warn us about the false Christ, the wars, rumors, wars, all these kinds of things. So these are the signs that will precede the end of the age and the return of Yeshua. And that's why we should have expectancy and not necessarily imminence, right? Having said all that, there is going to be a time when, at some point, after all the signs have manifest themselves, that his return truly is imminent, but not before then. All right, so just wanted to kind of drop that nugget into your mind right away so we can kind of be prepared for it. Let's keep reading my own essay. Through these parallel accounts, right, Matthew, Mark, Luke, the Olivet Discourse remains a pivotal discourse urging believers across time to heed its timeless exhortations. As I keep scrolling here, for the purposes of this short essay, I say we will be focusing our attention solely on Matthew's account. And again, it's just for brevity's sake. When I originally wrote these studies, I didn't have but a week to really teach them. They were taught live at my own congregation at Kehilat Nuba in Colorado. So I only had a week. They were like, each study was like 14 weeks or something like that. And so I only had really one night each week, was like one evening, so an hour or so to teach each topic. So that's why everything's so short. All right, let's keep reading this essay that I wrote. Matthew 24 is a chapter that has been the subject of much debate and discussion among scholars and theologians. We'll find out here why. It contains Jesus' teachings about the end times, including the signs of his coming and the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And if you consider that when you're looking at the end times prophecies, then Israel is at the center of God's end time prophetic timetable. God sets its clock using what he's doing with Israel, and so we keep an eye on Israel at any given epic or time of a period in history, so that we can get a sense of what God is doing in the earth, because the Bible is Israel-centric. And yet within Israel, the center of activity in Israel is Jerusalem. So once again, we keep our eye on Israel, but we keep our eye on Jerusalem, because that's the center of activity that's going to alert us to the events that are unfolding that would indicate the second coming of Yeshua, the rise of Antichrist, the rebellion of wicked mankind, and then eventually the ushering in of Yeshua's millennial kingdom. So Jerusalem is the epicenter there. And then within Jerusalem, it's the temple. It's the temple itself. So you can see we're working our way inwards in concentric circles. We start at concentric circles. We go from broadly looking at Israel, to zooming in and looking at Jerusalem, and to zooming in one more time and looking at the temple. So with that focus, we can instantly begin to realize that as Yeshua is having this discussion with his disciples, it's no wonder why, as they're sitting there on the Mount of Olives, gazing across the Kidron Valley, looking west towards Jerusalem, right? So if you remember what the layout of Israel and Jerusalem looks like, you got the Temple Mount on one side, and then the Kidron Valley separating the Temple Mount from the Mount of Olives on the east side. So the Temple Mount's on the west side, Kidron Valley is running right down the middle, Mount of Olives on the east side, and they're sitting there on the Mount of Olives looking west back across the Kidron Valley towards Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. And he's describing all these events that are going to unfold in the end times, again, 70 AD and the 70th week, so both events. And yet a lot of his focus is on the Temple Mount itself, right? Talking about the destruction. In fact, right away, right out of the gate, the disciples start talking about, oh, how beautiful the temple is, and all the stones and everything. And Yeshua's like, well, they're going to be turned upside down, right? Everything's going to fall apart at some point. All right, so that's another perspective we need to keep in mind. Let's keep reading my little essay. In this two-part essay, I say we will examine the different interpretations of this chapter, right? Chapter 51, chapter 24 of Matthew, and explore its significance for Christians today. Again, it's a two-parter. Topic 8 is part 1, and then topic 9 is part 2. And I just broke them up here for this study because originally I didn't have very much time to teach them, so I had to break it up into 2 parts.